As the United Kingdom edges ever closer to the March 29th Brexit deadline, with no deal yet in place, there is uncertainty around every corner, not just there, but also with allies and key trading partners such as Canada. Here to help us understand better what's ahead, the British High Commissioner to Canada, Susan le Jeune. And we are delighted to welcome you to TVO.
Thank you.
And having, I think, successfully said your last name once, I'm never going to say it again.
Oh, that's fine. Thank you for saying it perfectly the first time.
Let's go. What, did I get close?
You did.
I did. Okay, good. Your Prime Minister, of course, is back in Brussels. She is trying to negotiate a new deal after the initial one was rejected by the House of Commons. The EU has already said to her, the first deal is the best deal you're going to get, so you're wasting your time here. So I guess let's start with this. What's the point of going back?
Well, I think she's not looking to renegotiate the whole deal. The mandate that she was given by the House of Commons last week was to go and look again at one specific element of the deal, which is the backstop relating to the Northern Ireland border. She believes that it's possible to get something which would satisfy the people in the Commons who wanted some redefining of that deal. And so that's what she's in Brussels trying to do today. I'm
not sure you've got a willing partner in the EU, though, because we have seen some quotes coming out of the EU saying your country was, quote, pretending to negotiate, that you really don't have any new proposals, that you're, quote, kicking up dust, and it's all about photo ops. What do you think of that characterization?
Well, I think this is, I mean, that's politics, and I think we always have to look beyond the headlines and the people who want to grab the headlines for themselves. I think she's definitely gone to Brussels with the view of having a serious negotiation. I think there is a proposal that she'll be talking to them about, and I think the bottom line is, without some sort of amendment or addition to the deal that's on the table, we will be leaving on the 29th of March with no deal.
And how would you regard that?
Well, I don't think anybody wants that. I don't think anybody in Europe wants it, and I think there's only a tiny proportion of people in the UK who think that would be a good idea.
I think there is a view out there, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, I think there's a view out there that the very people who are sort of tasked with making Brexit happen, namely public servants such as yourself, are actually the people who oppose Brexit the most. Do you think that's true?
I think that there is a feeling amongst the people who want Brexit to happen tomorrow under any circumstances that the public service has been putting the brakes on to some extent. I don't think that's true at all. The British public service, I think, is one of the most apolitical public services in the whole world. We do the job that we're tasked to do by the government in place on the day. And whatever our personal views might be about the decision that was taken in 2016, we're all there to execute the decision that was taken. So the people who are negotiating in Brussels, the public servants who are negotiating, are doing that in good faith, and we are all working incredibly hard to get the best deal possible, which leaves the United Kingdom in the strongest position possible.
Did you vote in the referendum?
Yes, I did.
How did you vote?
I'm not going to tell you that.
Oh, come on, you can tell me.
I didn't vote to leave the European Union.
You did not vote to leave the
No.
European Union, so you voted Remain?
Yeah.
I thought you told me you weren't going to tell me.
I think it's fair enough. I mean, I think there are a lot of us who didn't vote to leave, but the majority of the population did vote to leave. And they, you know, that is what democracy is all about. And we now have to put that decision into action and implement it.
I don't have to tell you, there are many people who thought that the initial referendum, well, the only referendum to date, was, what's the parliamentary way of putting this? You know, less than great. And got a result that you'd never get again. Question, should there be a second referendum?
I don't think the Prime Minister thinks there should be a second referendum. I think many people believe that you could keep asking the same question over and over again, and you might get the same result, and you might get a different result, but unless the new result was really conclusive, I don't think that would necessarily take us much further forward. So I don't think that with the current government we are ever going to have a second referendum. What we're trying to do at the moment, what the Prime Minister is trying to do at the moment, is get a deal which, in the circumstances, is the best possible for the UK.
The politics in the UK right now is absolutely fascinating, and I guess in some respects absolutely terrifying. You've got a government that seems to be holding on by tenterhooks. You've got members of the Labour Party who have broken off. You now have Tory backbenchers who have broken off, and they've formed this new independent group. Have you ever seen anything like this before?
No, I haven't. In more than 30 years as a diplomat, I've never seen anything like it.
And what does it portend, do you think?
I think it portends that this referendum and this issue exposed some pretty deep splits within the country and within the parliamentary parties. I'm not at all surprised by what's happened. I think if you look at both the Conservative and the Labour parties, the two main parties in the UK, there are at least 3 factions within each of those parties. And what you're seeing now is the people coalescing, people who did not want to leave the European Union from both those parties coalescing into a new political movement. They're not a political party at the moment. It's not surprising, but I think what it shows is that there are some pretty deep divisions within the country, which will take a long time to overcome.
Let us share some stats, which you know, but which our audience may not, on the nature of the UK-Canada relationship. You are, of course, the mothership for English Canada. So, Sheldon, if you would, let's bring these graphics up. Total trade of goods and services between Canada and the UK was more than $30 billion last year, and that was an 8.2% increase from the year before. The UK, as you might expect, is the biggest trading partner Canada has within the European Union. Canada, however, we're not quite as important to you as you are to us. Canada is the UK's 19th largest trading partner, and we account for only 1.4% of total UK trade. The number one good exported from over there to over here is quote-unquote machinery and mechanical appliances. The number one good that we export from over here to you is precious stones and metals, and that is 2/3 of all UK goods imported from Canada. There are 830 Canadian companies in the UK. They employ around 100,000 people. We know these names: Bombardier, RBC, for example. And there are more than 700 UK firms in this country, and they employ about 100,000 people, and 40,000 are in this province. And again, we know those names: HSBC, for example, the bank, and Rolls-Royce. Here's a question, since clearly you're kind of not as into us as we are into you, if I can put it that way. Do you think the UK takes its relationship with Canada for granted?
I think it has done. I think that's a very fair point. I think because it's a comfortable relationship, because we don't have any serious bilateral problems or disagreements, I think there has been a tendency to take it for granted. I think that's changing. I think the whole Brexit issue has made us look again and refocus at some of these relationships which are traditional and as I say, comfortable. And we are investing more effort, and we are putting more resource into our relationship with Canada. So I've got extra staff working for me in Ottawa, which is a real sign that the government in the UK is taking this relationship more seriously and wants to get more out of it. So I think you're right. I think we need to do more. We need to take it more seriously. We need to value it more. But I don't think that is going to be difficult to achieve. I think I'm pushing at an open door when I say this relationship needs to be more important. And I think for all sorts of reasons, that's a feeling which is replicated in Canada. So we are working much more closely together on things today than we have been, I think, at any time in the past. And that's great. And it makes it a very good time to be doing my job here.
If and when your country actually does leave the European Union, what does that potentially do to the Canadian-UK relationship?
I think it means that we will be, in some ways, freer to work with you on big foreign policy issues. Outside the European Union, we won't be bound by EU positions so much, which gives us a bit more leeway to sometimes take a more forward position on certain issues. I think you can already see, for example, on Venezuela, that the UK is working very closely with Canada, and that will continue. We work very closely on Syria when we helped together to get the White Helmets civilian peacekeepers out of Syria. And I think there'll be more such issues where we'll work closely together. On the trade relationship, we will be working as the UK, not as part of the EU, and that will allow us, once we've left, to have, I think, an even closer, even more productive trade relationship. Well,
okay, that's one potential interpretation. The other interpretation is that we have a sophisticated trading relationship with you now as part of the European Union, the CETA, C-E-T-A trade agreement. If you're out of the EU, we don't have a free trade agreement with you. We'd have to presumably create one?
Yes.
So have those negotiations begun yet?
Yes. Well, they're not negotiations. We're not allowed to negotiate while we're a member of the EU.
So discussions?
Yes. Technical discussions is what we call them. So they are taking place even as we speak. They are productive and constructive discussions. But, you know, any trade negotiation is difficult, and Canadians are very good trade negotiators. So
you're buttering us up now.
No, I'm just being very, very honest.
Oh.
Those discussions are continuing, and I'm confident that we will get to the point where we have a deal that we could use if we did not leave the European Union with a withdrawal agreement. So if we crash out of the European Union on the 29th of March, I'm confident that there will be something which will allow Canada and the UK to continue to benefit from the terms of CETA. And then once we're out, we'll look at improving on CETA for the future, but we can't do that till we've actually left.
So you think CETA would stay in place until a new agreement came forward?
There would be a bilateral agreement which would replicate, I hope, the benefits of CETA.
To avoid any uncertainties?
Cliff edge, exactly. Yes.
What did you call it?
A cliff edge.
Say it again?
Cliff edge.
Oh, cliff edge. Okay. You Brits, you have a funny way of saying a lot of stuff. It's good.
Thanks.
Okay. Do you fear that both countries might put tariffs on each other until things got solid?
I think that's a risk. If we don't get a replication of the CETA agreement, that's a risk. And I don't think either of us would want that. I certainly don't think business on either side of the Atlantic would think that was a good idea.
You've been talking to businesses there and here, of course.
Yes.
And what are they saying about the situation?
They are very keen for there to be a safety net, a CETA safety net, in case we crash out with no deal.
British diplomats all over the world, yourself included, obviously, are on a bit of a charm offensive right now, I guess, in an attempt to kind of calm the waters. How choppy do you think the waters are out there right now about what your country's going through?
I think, you know, anybody who reads the newspapers or watches the television will see that the country's in some political turmoil. And one of the things that I and my colleagues have to try and do is reassure people that, you know, that doesn't actually make any difference to what the UK still fundamentally is, which is a country which believes very firmly in the rule of law and certain values. Our economy remains fundamentally strong. We are still an open and welcoming country. But, you know, you're right, we are having to put some considerable effort into articulating those messages to counter some of the things that people see in their newspapers every day.
Who's Sir Simon MacDonald?
He's my boss.
Yes, he is, from the Foreign Office. And he says Brexit will make it, quote, more difficult for the UK to exert influence in the world. So how are you going to do this?
Well, we'll work more closely with partners like Canada. I think we will have to be more energetic in articulating the things that we think are important. I think we will probably have to pick our fights, if you like. We will have to decide what are the issues that are most important to us and invest time and effort in those. So on things like climate change, they remain a huge priority for our government, and we will continue to work towards those goals. But yeah, you're right. If you're not part of a big bloc of 300 and something million and you're just the UK, then it will be more difficult than it was before.
I'm going to spell this word before I say it. C-A-N-Z-U-K. Kenzuk.
Yep.
Is that how you say it?
I suppose that's how you say it, yeah.
Okay. What is that?
Well, it's an idea that some people have that Canada, the UK, New Zealand and Australia could form a sort of I don't know, free movement bloc, I think, is at the heart of it, so that there would be easier movement of people, workers, and so on within those four countries. So it's a bit of an embryonic idea. As you know, one of the reasons that the Brexit vote went the way it did was because people were concerned about free movement. So I don't think this is necessarily the moment to start talking about more free movement between countries, but if we were looking to deepen our relationships or strengthen our relationships with some of our old partners, then those are the sorts of things that we would obviously want to have on the table.
Well, I was going to say, this is, you talk about free movement here within Commonwealth countries that share a lot of the same values, unlike, I think, some of the problems that were identified in Brexit.
Yes.
Does that make this more likely to happen then?
I think if we were going to look at a new approach to our immigration policy more generally, those are the sorts of countries where some more flexibility might be possible. But, you know, there are already quite a lot of things which make movement between our four countries easier than, for example, between the UK and South Africa. So there are building blocks that you could use as a start to that sort of idea.
I think the Conservative Party of Canada actually endorsed this idea at their recent policy convention. So there is some appetite for it here.
There is, I think, and I think it's you know, one of the things that freer movement does build up, and you see it where there are schemes for young people to travel, for example, a sort of working holiday visa scheme, is that it builds up relationships and it builds up links which then come to fruition later on. So if you've been to study or done a working holiday in Canada or New Zealand or where it is when you're 18 or 19, then you have an understanding of and an affection for that country, which, you know, stays with you when you continue in your later career.
High Commissioner, we recently had another guest in that chair who was a demographics and nationalism expert, if you like, and he raised the notion that English Canada has a unique lack of attachment these days to our British motherland, that we don't sort of have the same kind of ethnic founding myth that, for example, Quebec would have with France, or a sense of peoplehood in the same way as it relates to the United Kingdom. Have you experienced this notion in your travels across this country?
No, I've actually experienced just the opposite. I mean, I'm still amazed by the depth of affection and the closeness of the links that exist between the UK and Canada.
To what do you attribute it?
I think it's partly family links. I think it's the fact that we know each other's countries very well. Many people travel in both directions. But I think it is changing. I think where your demographics expert is probably right is that is changing. As the Canadian population changes, then there won't be as many people with those sorts of links. So that's why I say that we can't take this relationship for granted, and we can't assume that the historical links between our countries will be enough to see us into the future.
I partly asked because we love it when formerly classified documents get declassified. It's always good fun looking back at this stuff. And here's something from 35 years ago. One High Commissioner named John Wilson wrote in 1984 that Canadians were, quote, convinced that the more we concentrate on the European community, the less we bother with them. Canadians felt Brits cared about their relationship with Europe and, frankly, not that much about us. Is that a fair characterization of the way things are?
I don't think it's a fair characterization. I think that there was a shift of focus. I think that's absolutely right, and we invested a lot in our relationship over the last 40 years with the European Union. And I think the countries where things were easy and comfortable, as I said earlier, are those in which resources were not devoted in the same way as perhaps they should have been. So I think I don't think it was deliberate, but I think that's what happened, and I think we're now trying to redress that balance a bit and refocus.
Let me ask you about the delicate matter of Her Majesty the Queen's security. If Brexit goes really badly south, is there some kind of evacuation plan for the Queen just in case?
I think that there are, I'm pretty certain that there are plans in place to take care of Her Majesty the Queen in every possible circumstance. But I don't think there's a specific Brexit exit plan for the Queen.
Well, I don't have to tell you, there was during World War II, right, for some royalty, and you know, the Dutch royal family ended up over here.
Yes, but ours didn't.
Yours did not, no, of course not. So, I mean, it just does raise the question. Of course, your newspapers back home have been speculating about such things. Are people worried about the safety of the royal family at these times?
No, I don't think so. No, I think the you know, I think what's very interesting about the whole, even despite all the emotion that there has been around the Brexit issue, the huge demonstrations that have taken place on the streets of London have been entirely peaceful. So while emotions are very high, they haven't bubbled up or boiled over into violent confrontations of any kind, and I would expect that to continue. Okay.
Can you help Canadians understand this phenomenon where apparently a good chunk of the 52% of the people who voted in favor of leaving the European Union don't seem to care if it affects them in the pocketbook? They are more worried about other things. And of course, we are led to believe that politics overwhelmingly these days, is all about what's happening economically. Can you get us inside that mindset?
So I think there are two things. I think, first of all, the negative economic impact, which I think most people agree will happen, including the Governor of the Bank of England, who you very kindly lent to us.
Great Canadian news.
Is not beginning really yet to bite. So I think people don't feel yet in their pockets, as you say, the impact. But I think the second thing is that there's another side to the economic argument, which was that people felt that globalisation, being part of this huge single market and all those economic opportunities, hadn't actually made any difference to them. So they could not see any benefit economically to them of being part of the European Union and the whole globalisation, the change that globalisation of the economy had brought. So I think that's the way in which the economic argument played into the result, but that was not the most important thing. I think the arguments which won it for the Leave side were all about the control of the border and the control of, as they said, of our legislation and our laws, and those were the two things I think that really hit home with the people who voted to leave.
If the United Kingdom is able to leave the European Union, do you think that hastens any momentum behind any of the constituent members of the United Kingdom leaving that?
Neither Northern Ireland nor Scotland voted to leave.
Right.
And the majority in those two parts of the Union was to stay. Northern Ireland is a particularly complicated issue, which is dominating the current discussions. In Scotland, they've already had an independence referendum, which went against independence, and that was fairly recent. Nicola Sturgeon was here in Toronto last week, and she was talking about a second independence referendum.
The leader of the Scottish National Party.
She's the leader of the Scottish Nationalists, the First Minister of Scotland. So obviously it's in her mind, but I wouldn't want to speculate about when and if that might happen.
Donald Tusk, President of the European Council, had a delicious quote the other day, said there was a special place in hell for those who promoted Brexit without a subsequent plan. Can you understand this sentiment?
I think when you see the political turmoil that's happening in the United Kingdom at the moment, you can understand why he might say something like that. I think what is true, on the other hand, is that the Prime Minister is pursuing her objectives very clearly. She does have a plan, and she is determined to execute that plan. I think it's very interesting that some of the people who were the most vocal proponents of Brexit are no longer part of the government. I mean, there were 2 or 3 ministers who were very much in the forefront of that campaign who have decided, for their own reasons, to leave the government. Her
political demise has been predicted basically every day since that vote, and yet she's still there. What do you think that says? I think that it shows she has astonishing resilience. She is a woman with a great sense of duty, who is determined to carry out the task that she was elected to do. And I think she has been astonishing in the way that she is carrying it out. And I have a huge amount of admiration for her, as I imagine a lot of other people do. Well, High Commissioner, I'm going to try one more time to say your name and thank you. That is Susan le Jeune d'Algerzuk. Did I get close?
Yeah, very close.
Okay. I hate close. I want to be right on. What's your maiden name?
Miller.
Oh, why couldn't you have kept that?
Because my husband gave up his career to follow me around the world, so I gave up my name.
Okay, well, that seems like a fair trade. Anyway, High Commissioner, it's really good of you to spend so much time with us today. Thanks so much.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.